I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, my family, my longtime friends, and you members. It's been a pleasure. This has been a long journey for me, but a lot longer for my great-grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
He enlisted as a private in the 3rd Massachusetts Light Volunteer Cavalry. He actually came from Gloucester and had been a fisherman since the age of 14 on the Gloucester schooner. But at 17, when the call came out and got to those folks in Gloucester, he and some of his young friends thought, what a great adventure this will be. So, let's join the cavalry. In those days, the idea of the cavalry would be like today to a young man being a jet pilot. It was different than running around on your feet. So, next. This was the battle flag that they gave later on to the regiment. Now, I will say this at this time. The 3rd Mass Cavalry was not the original group. It was eventually made up after a couple of years from a combination of other groups. And it wasn't, originally, as I say, he joined the 3rd Massachusetts Volunteer Cavalry, Company C. Okay, next one. Okay.
I'm trying. I'm so bad. I don't know.
Okay. More about this one later. We'll pass that. Next one, Carol. All right, this on the left-hand side is the rosette of Sheridan's Cavalry Corps. On the right is a facsimile of my great-grandfather, and I'll tell you more about the details of that later on. Next one. This is his enlistment papers. Actually, his papers said that he was 19. He was actually 17. Next one. His father was also a fishing captain. His son never served on the same fishing schooner, but as I said, he went to sea when he was 14, and he was 17 when the war was declared, and he decided that he wanted to do something a little bit more dramatic than fishing. Next one. This unit, the Massachusetts Light Volunteer Cavalry, was actually sent to Camp Chase at Lowell, and they really originally were trained as infantry. But eventually, when they finished the infantry training, they then were trained as cavalry. Now, it's interesting because most of these men had never been on a horse before, and certainly my great-grandfather had never been on a horse before. The family never owned horses. They were actually better trained than most people in the Civil War. The training was on for several months, and as I say, because they got the infantry training first, they did not realize it, but it was going to come in good stead later on in the war. Next one, Carol.
Next one.
Okay, next one. The officer in charge of the regiment was, or the company, was a gentleman who was a very wealthy man, and he was designated as the colonel, and his family owned a piano place, piano factory in Boston. Okay. All right, next. When they finished their training, they went to Boston by train, and then they left on a steamship Constitution for Fort Monroe in Virginia. They left Boston on January 13th, and they arrived 3 days later at Fort Monroe. Next one. Once they got to Boston, Fort Monroe, then they were sorted out, and there was other units, of course, coming from other areas, and what would become the 3rd Mass boarded the steamer North Star for New Orleans, and the first stop was Ship Island, Mississippi. Now I've been there, and more about that later on. Ship Island actually is 12 miles off the coast of Biloxi, Mississippi. They arrived at Ship Island on the 12th of February. And they left on the 4th. Okay, next one. After 2 months there, which was spent mostly in sorting themselves out with other groups. There was other regiments there. They then left and they went to New Orleans, and again were getting sorted out with regiments that were coming from other areas. And they spent 2 months in New Orleans doing basic garrison duty and getting used to campaigning in the Gulf. Okay, next one, Jim. Of course, while they're there, everybody knows about things. General Ben Butler was not happy with the way that they were being treated and so forth, and made his own pronouncements about the people that, especially the women, that were mistreating his soldiers. On August of 1862, the 3rd Mass Light Cavalry became part of Wetzel's Brigade, and that was stationed in Thibodaux, Louisiana. The 3rd was in battle for the first time at the Battle of Georgia Landing on October 27th, 1862. It was more or less a training battle for them, and they were fortunate they did not suffer any casualties. Next one. From April of 1863 to June 3rd of 1863, they were in action in what is now called the Tesh Campaign, and that got them a chance to get acclimated, primarily the weather. Now, we all know what we just experienced in this past week here. Now, you can imagine that was the weather every day in the Gulf. And these men were not used to that. As bear in mind that they came from spring down there. One of the big things that, being in the cavalry, remember, or if you didn't know, they always wore that heavy woolen Union suits. They wore heavy woolen clothing, woolen breeches, jackets, shirts, everything. And one of the problems is that they developed, because of the heat and the dirt and the grime, they developed terrible boils and carbuncles. And especially in the area where they're riding in the saddle. They come up with an idea of trying to solve it, which was kind of winging it, so to speak. But they decided if they use lanolin from their knees to their belt buckle and smeared that all over their body, they could put that woolen uniform back over. Now, if you can imagine what an ungodly mess it made, but it kept the carbuncles and the boils down and solved that problem. He also told my mother and my uncle that they looked forward to riding through rivers and riding into lakes. Not only the soldiers, but the horses,
Yeah.
because it was the only relief they had from the heat and the bugs. They had a minor skirmish at a place called Simmsport, Louisiana, and for the first time, this was well, it was considered a minor skirmish. It developed into a battle, and his close buddy was another Gloucester fisherman who had joined with him for the thrill of being in the cavalry. His name was Daniel McCauley, and he was killed. And he felt very badly, even years later, talking about it, because he said it was a skirmish that nobody ever heard about, nobody cared, and yet my closest friend was killed. Next one, Cal. Now, the three companies, on June 17th, the three companies of the Massachusetts Light Cavalry were combined with the 41st Massachusetts Infantry to form the 3rd Mass Cavalry. But this is really not 100% accurate. There were several different formations that they started and dissolved, and then they started again. But the third Mass Volunteer Infantry was fortunate in that they had already been trained as cavalry at Camp Chase and Lowell, where the others had not. Okay, next one.
That's true.
Next one. Oops. Back. This is James Ewer. He was the author of the history of the 3rd Mass Cavalry, and I have a copy here on the table. Very informative. I'll bring up some of the points that is cleared up in the history later on. But it was a very, very interesting book. Needless to say, it covered 4 years of the war. We're trying to cover it in an hour. Next one. Okay. And the next one. Now, this is part of the training. The training was very repetitive, but very thorough. And as I said, some of the men had been already trained as cavalry, but most of them had not. So even though it was repetitive for the ones who had already been trained in it, it was still valued because there was always a different viewpoint. All right, go ahead. Now, we've all heard of Grierson, or most of us have heard of Grierson's raid. Now, as it happened, that this uniform, this group, teamed up with Grierson's brigade, and they fought mostly with Grierson's brigade. Grierson was operating with the 3rd Mass near Port Hudson, just prior to the battle. The 3rd Mass was involved in the Battle of Clinton, Louisiana on June 3rd, 1863. They were fighting there with Grierson's brigade. Next. Now, the Battle of Port Hudson was particularly important for several reasons. One of the things that I ran across doing all this work was that the record keeping was very inconsistent, and I could not understand why. In some cases, there was copies of his pay records and attendance records that were fairly accurate by the week or by the month. And then there was others where it was combined like 2 or 3 months into one, and I couldn't understand why that was happening. Pay records were sometimes by the month and sometimes combined into 2 or 3 months. And then I was reading in the history that 3 things happened during their episode, and I'll bring, even though some of them are beyond this point here, but what had happened was this. The regimental wagons in crossing the rivers on 2 occasions tipped over with all of the handwritten records and material and so forth in the water. And so consequently, the squadron or the company clerks were tasked with the problem of rewriting this stuff. And then, of course, the first time it happened, they rewrote it and condensed it to a certain extent. The second time it happened, now they do it all over again, now it condensed it even more. Well, then they had another problem at the Battle of Port Hudson. They had arranged themselves so that all of the equipment, the individual equipment, the knapsacks and so forth, and the regimental wagons and everything, they had arrived, and the third mast now had arrived and taken over a very large barn and complex. And they had sent troopers to guard this property and so forth while they were gone. While they were gone, those barns and buildings were attacked by a small group of Confederates who killed all of the third mast guards, stole everything they wanted, and then burned the barn down with everything in it. So now they're faced with a third problem, third time that they've got to reconstitute all the records and everything. Plus the men lost all their personal equipment. Okay, this is from his official records. To elaborate on this a little bit, one of his other little close friends was a fellow from Reading, Mass., another teenager, and this young man's horse was killed, and this man was wounded. The captain told my great-grandfather to take him back behind the lines and to sit with him, and just sit with him. Now, I assume it meant until he passed away, and that's exactly what happened. He took the young man back, and now this is his second closest friend. And he took him back and put him up against stood him down beside a tree and sat with him and talked to him until he passed away. And so then my great-grandfather left him, and my great-grandfather goes back into battle. Well, that didn't work out too well either. As he goes back into battle, he's coming in on one flank, and his horse was killed, and he was wounded. But I must say this, my great-grandfather led a charmed life. He never even he got seriously wounded, not seriously wounded, slightly wounded, but he didn't even get an infection. In fact, he served the whole war and never even got sick. And part of the reason that he never got sick was, and this became obvious to some of his senior officers, was that they noticed that the group around him never got sick from the water. And it took a while for it to start to sink in. They wanted to know why. But he brought some of the training that he had learned on the fishing schooners. On the fishing schooners, they would have these huge casks of water, and they'd be out for a while, and then sediment would form in the water. So they would scoop the sediment out, throw it away, and they brought mud and straw with them on these schooners, and they built a Mickey Mouse type of a filter. And they filtered the water through this clay and straw. Once they did that, then they boiled the water. Now, that was preliminary to boiling it again for coffee. So actually, they had taken the sediment out of the water. It had been boiled twice. And as I say, the men around him were not getting sick. And the officers wanted to know why, how come. And also, he learned tricks that they had learned about using salted beef on the fishing boats and other forms of meat too. And so they finally said, you know, we got to pay attention to this man. So eventually it led to him along the line being appointed as a commissary sergeant. But anyway, this was all happened after and during and after the Battle of Port Hudson. Right. After the battle, the three companies of the Massachusetts Light Cavalry were once again reorganized and then combined with the 41st Massachusetts Infantry and also mounted infantry, and they finally formed a formal unit called the 3rd Mass Cavalry. Now this is on June 17, 1863. Next. August 3rd, 1863, with the Battle of Jackson, Louisiana. 4 men from the 3rd Mass were killed. You can see in this photograph here, they're using sabers. Apparently, the sabers were used more often than we have been led to believe. They used their carbines, but they also used the sabers a lot. Okay. On September 1st, 1863, roughly 2 years after he joined, we have him getting promoted from private to corporal. Next one. From July 8, 1863 to January 8, 1864, the 3rd Mass was in the saddle almost every single day. Now, any of you folks that know anything about horses and so forth would realize what a project that is. And again, we're talking about miserable conditions, heat, rain, everything. By January 8, 1864, they were completely worn out. The men were worn out, the horses were worn out, and the equipment was deteriorating. So they were sent to New Orleans to rest and to re-equip. Now, on February 1st, 1864, I don't know why, but he re-enlisted. And when his family asked him why, after putting up with all that, you could have gone home, why did you re-enlist? And his answer was simple. He said, you know, I just really wanted to see it through. He was in the Red River Campaign in Louisiana and Texas. Okay, next one. The history of that campaign was not particularly glowing as far as the Union was concerned. It was some serious mistakes were made. On March 21st, 1864, next one, he was in the Battle of Henderson Hill. Next was the Battle of Mansfield, Louisiana, and then the Battle of Sabine Crossroads on April 8th. That's a little bit more famous. Next one, Carol. You. Next one. One thing about this history book that I have is that the maps are excellent. Yeah, we have some friends of ours from the Round Table, Sullivan, who was a very fanatic on history books without maps, but he would love this one. That one showed the position of the 3rd Mass Cavalry at Sabine Crossroads on April 8th. This was another opportunity that the Confederates missed at the Bunnett's crossing. They were not aware that the Union was not aware that the Confederates were so close. The Confederates knew what was going on, but for some reason or other did not act on it, and they let Banks' army pass by. Next one, Carl. On May 1st, 1864, he was promoted to sergeant. The 3rd Mass had been patrolling constantly from March 2nd to May 22nd. This was the second bout now, after they had been rebuilt. They had covered over 500 miles and been in action 30 times. On May 1st, the Battle of Alexandria, May 4th, Mansoria, Louisiana, and May 19th, Yellow Bayou, Louisiana. The 3rd Mass was then decided by virtue of Grant's order to Banks to split that regiment up and to move them up into Virginia. So the 3rd Mass Cav moved to Virginia, to the Shenandoah. And he was on this first steamship. The irony of it is, when they got to Washington, now I think most of you are familiar with Early coming from the battle of and attacking, with plans to attack Washington. The story is that he got, that Early sent some scouts to reconnoiter the sentries and what kind of forces were guarding Washington. And they went back to Early and said, this is going to be easy because they're all green troops. They got brand new uniforms. They're not sunburned. They're nothing. They're brand new troops. There's nothing to it. This is going to be an easy battle. But Early, being the wise old fox that he was, thought, I better send some other guys to get a second look. Well, in the meantime, between the first observation and the second observation, they had brought up the 6th Corps and the 19th Corps. The 6th Corps had come up from Lower Virginia, but the 19th Corps had just come in from Fortress Monroe as 2 battle-hardened Army Corps. But what the scouts went back to Early and told them was, these are not new guys. Their uniforms are bleached out. They're sunburned mahogany. These are tough old campaigners, and we're going to have a battle on our hands if we try this. Early very wisely said, fine. And he did not, obviously, as we know, he did not attack Washington. At this time, Sergeant Clancy was given an opportunity to go home to Gloucester. Now, the story is that he may or may not have been told when he went home to Gloucester for 30 days to see if he couldn't fill up the ranks from Gloucester area of some of the men that were missing, killed, and died. And whether he did or he didn't, we don't know, and he never said what he did. But anyway, he went home by train from Virginia to Gloucester, had 30 days leave, and came back and thought, and this is his words, I thought I was going to have it fairly easy in the Shenandoah. Well, unfortunately, he arrived just in time for the Battle of Ober. And when that cleared up, he got involved in the second battle, and he got in the Battle of Winchester. Oh, that's a funny story there. And, at the battle, after Winchester, they got. Oh, by the way, I forgot. When they arrived in Virginia, Sheridan was appointed in charge of the 19th Corps, and he decided that he had enough cavalry, and he dismounted them. Now they fought as dismounted cavalry infantry. Well, in the Battle of Cedar Creek, where he fought as infantry, he lost his canteen. And as you may not know, that after a battle in those days, they had an after-battle summary of the equipment and stuff was lost, dead, wounded, and so forth. And he had lost his canteen. He also lost some equipage, some other equipage. But he didn't bother. That didn't concern him. But he was enraged to think that because he just went through a ferocious battle and he lost his canteen, that he was being charged 45 cents. And it bothered him so bad, he was still talking about it 50 years later. But he refused. The irony of it is, he refused to pay him the 45 cents, even though he could have, because he felt it was unjust. The other fee was $2.50, but he thought that was fair. So he paid the $2.50, but he would not pay the 45 cents. So after the battle, okay, next one. I think most of you are familiar with the Battle of Cedar Creek, so we won't get into that. That's a topic of all by itself. The 3rd Mass part of the 19th Corps was in the middle and had support from the 6th Corps and some others. One of the things that he said was that he would never forget when they started because in the Battle of Cedar Creek, the Union Army retreated several miles. And they finally, when Sheridan showed up back on the scene, he was like God to them. They were revitalized, and he reorganized them, and they started to attack the Confederates again. So when they started, he said that, because now, bearing in mind, the 3rd Mass Cavalry is fighting as infantry now. But on one side, they got Custer's cavalry coming. On the other side, they got Merritt's cavalry. In all, there was roughly 12,000 cavalry, 6,000 in each squadron coming. Now, those of you who have been to Cedar Creek would know that that ground there is shale. And he said to the day he died, he would never forget the sound of 12,000 horses clattering on shale, attacking the Confederates. And he said, you know, if I was a Confederate, I would have run too. He said, it was the noise alone, never mind being shot at, never mind any cannons or anything, the noise alone would frighten anybody. Okay, next. On the right is the emblem and badge of, as I showed you at the very beginning, of Sheridan's Cavalry Corps, the rosette. And on the left is the insignia of the Massachusetts State Adjutant General's office. To wear the two of them you had to have the approval of the governor and the state of Massachusetts Adjutant General's award. Now, after the Battle of Cedar Creek, there was some other skirmishing, but eventually the regiment went into winter quarters at Pleasant Valley, Maryland. And after that, they were, as a reward for their bravery at Cedar Creek and also for the other Valley campaigns, Sheridan had them re-equipped as cavalry. Okay. Sorry. This is the fighting that they called down the valley. Okay. Right here. Okay. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. My great-grandfather told my mother and my uncle that one of the proudest moments in his whole life had been and would ever be but the day they wrote in the Grand Review in Washington. He said all of the sadness and all of the worry and all of the turmoil that they had been through, he said, was erased for the most part on one day, and that was the day that the 3rd Mass Cavalry wrote in the Grand Review. But behind it all was the thought that the war was over and now we're all going home, and it's all behind us now. Next. But that's not really what happened.
Oh, geez.
They got on the train, they went to the remount station at Point Pleasant, Maryland, where they gave up their horses and all their equipment, and they got on the train, they thought for Boston. Well, these fellows, look, they didn't have railroad maps, the soldiers didn't, and they're looking out the window and they're saying, you know, this doesn't look like we're going towards Boston. The next biggest town that they went through was West Virginia. And they said, this is really wrong. Now the officers themselves are concerned. They're asking the train crew what's going on. The train crew wouldn't talk to them. So they said, this is really bad now. So anyway, the train keeps on going till the train gets to St. Louis. Now they're convinced that they're in trouble. They marched off the train with their equipment, marched through St. Louis to the docks of the Missouri River. And they're put on steamboats heading up the Missouri. and the steamboat goes to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas is now the head cavalry headquarters for the whole western United States. There they find out that they're not even going to stay in Fort Leavenworth. They're going further west. So they're packed up, leave. Next one, please. They leave Fort Leavenworth, and they're told that they're heading for, next one, please. They're heading for, well, that's an old shot of, that's on the lower left, that's Fort Leavenworth in the day. As I said, it was the cavalry headquarters for the whole western United States. Next one. So they find out that that's not the end of the trip, that they're going to take a military trail from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to Fort Kearny, Nebraska. It took them 19 days in heat like we just had last week to go 19 days on with the, now they are on horseback and with the regimental wagons, of course. They finally get there at Fort Kearny. They gave them 8 days rest in the field, and then they told them that they had to go to Cottonwood Springs, which is on the border of Colorado. So they head out, and now they're even madder. And the officers were even more mad than the men, because the officers, they had businesses and professions back in Massachusetts, and they were not given any option to, I mean, this was the orders and this is what they had to do. So anyway, in the meantime, the officers would keep on screaming and going for the telegraph and so on, back to Boston saying, hey, get us back here, cut this out. And anyway, they didn't stop until they actually got to Cottonwood Creek, Nebraska, which, like I said, is on the Colorado border. And they were told then that they could turn around and go back to Fort Kearny. And the interesting thing here was, my uncle asked him, what were you doing on the way from Fort Kearny to Nebraska, to Colorado? They were apparently, during the Civil War, the Indians, knowing that the main cavalry was fighting in the east, were raiding stage lines, burning telegraph lines, were generally ruining everything all the way without any opposition. So the idea of the cavalry was this cavalry was to restore order. Now, it wasn't just the 3rd Mass Cavalry. I think there was another regiment from Michigan that was with them. Anyway, so when my uncle said, well, when the order came, another important thing they were doing is they were guarding wagon trains of civilians which were heading west. And my uncle said to them, well, how did your men feel when they're turning around and they're going back and they're abandoning the wagon trains? He said, I want to tell you exactly how we felt. We enlisted in the Army to fight the war, and the war was over. Nobody made these people get on wagon trains, no matter how valid their reasons or how justified they were getting on the wagons. That was their business. It was also their business to provide their own security. We did not feel that it was our business to provide security for somebody who decided to go in a wagon train that we had no part of and no interest in. But he said, that's the way it was, so I don't know what happened to the wagon trains. He said, but we went back to Nebraska, and then back to Fort Kearny. But when they get to Fort Kearny, there was another problem. the colonel at Fort Kearny was enraged to think that his orders had been supervised, not supervised, but overruled, and that he was now losing a valuable, battle-tested cavalry regiment. So, what he did was, he took all their horses away from them. And the only horses were dragging the wagons. And he made them walk back to Fort Leavenworth. But here's the part that I get a kick out of. When they went west from Fort Leavenworth, they had horses, and it took them 19 days to get to Fort Kearny. On the way east, back to Fort Leavenworth, they're walking, and it only took them 11 days. I have a feeling that perhaps they were dragging a little bit on the way west. This is the summary of the regiment. The irony of it was Fort Kearny was further west than they ever got, fighting in the south. This is their final battle flag. Next, please. This is the pink granite monument that they established at the Winchester National Cemetery. I've seen this several times. Very imposing. It was dedicated on September 18th, 1888, on the 24th anniversary of the Third Battle of Winchester. The men, on that day, the regiment went to Boston, and by train, they had a reunion, and on the train, a large number of them went by train to Winchester. Now, the city of Winchester knew they were coming to dedicate this monument, and the mayor and the city really had a big ceremony for them, which included a large banquet and so forth. While they were having this, my great-grandfather told my uncle that a local newspaper reporter happened to approach others, but approached my great-grandfather and said, what do you think of this function, festival that we've provided for you men, so while you dedicate your monument? And my great-grandfather said, I told him that I thought it was very generous of the city of Winchester, very courteous of the mayor, and it was a fine feed, fine food, so forth. And then but the newspaper reporter wasn't satisfied. He said, but how did you feel sitting across the table with all of these Confederate veterans? And my great-grandfather said, I looked at the reporter, stared him right in the face and said, it's because of them that we're here. And there wasn't another question. Now, next one, please. Next one. The photograph on the left was my great-grandfather taken when he was 85 years old. The sketch on the right was him as a young man. Next one. And that is his grave in Gloucester today. And my daughter here and I, every year, we go down and we clean the stone and we put flowers down and put the flag up for the girl. That is the ribbon that went with the medal that they wore when they went to the dedication in Winchester. And that, my dear friends, was the adventures of my great-grandfather. Now, as a postscript, in 2001 and 2002, excuse me, in 2001 and 2002, I decided that I wanted to see these places myself. So I went down to the Gulf, and well, first off, I wrote to the superintendent of Ship Island off of Biloxi. And I told them that I would like to go, and what I wanted to do, why I wanted to do it, and so forth. And the superintendent, Miss Gail Bishop, told me that I would be welcome. So I did go down there. And as it happened, the day I was there, she was off to another location. But she had left word to her assistant that I was to be given, after the normal tour, I was to be given full range for photographic and research purposes, which I thought was very, very kind of her. And I took all the photographs that I wanted to. I stayed as long as I wanted to. In fact, I stayed until the last boat was going back to Biloxi. Now, after that, I wrote another letter to the superintendent. I wrote two letters, one to the superintendents at Fort Leavenworth and also Fort Kearny. Fort Leavenworth was then and is still an active duty Army post. But when I got there, I told the person at the gate what I wanted, and he contacted the director of the museum, and he came out to the gate and met me and took me back to the museum, where I had a fantastic tour of their museum, which is unbelievable. And after that, I then started west to Fort Kearny, Nebraska. Now, that is now the old military trail over the Little Blue River, the Large Blue River, and so forth, is now Route 11. But anyway, I got to Fort Kearny, and once again, the superintendent, now Fort Kearny is now a state park, but extremely well run. The superintendent there welcomed me, having received my letter, and said, "Oh, we've been looking forward to seeing you. You're the first one from that regiment and that period of time that's ever been here. But," she said, "I looked back in our equipment, our files and so forth, and I found something that I think that you would really enjoy." And she, with her assistant, they pulled out this huge map, a series of maps actually, and the maps were on a roll as large as that screen. And they were done at the time, active time, by Army engineers who were there. And so she had the dates, the 8 days that the 3rd Mass Cavalry was there, and she unrolled and found a full-scale map like that of the post and the location on the post where the 3rd Mass, listed as transit troops, was camped. And she said, "Let's go out and walk the ground." So we did. I walked the ground, and she said, "Here, look it. This is where the senior non-commissioned officers, which would have been like my great-grandfather, the sergeant's tent. There was only 3 areas, 3 tents where they were. And we walked over them. And I thought, oh, this is really fantastic. As we walked over them, there was a dust devil between us. Now, I will say this. The weather was very hot and very dry, and there was probably a lot of dust around, but there was no dust in that area, except where we were walking the tents of the senior non-commissioned officers. And we all stopped, and we looked at each other, and nobody said a word. And the superintendent looked at me and shook her head, and we just continued on. When we came back, we walked back in the office. She put the maps away. I thanked her very much, and we still never said a word about the dust devil. And that, my folks, are the adventures of my great-grandfather.
Yay.